Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. We do have the World Championships starting tomorrow. Who else is ready besides me? Exactly. I know all of you guys are. But I did want to go back. I had kind of started doing this little series with Wesley So, the first time he played like major people. And before I go any further, as always, at the very top of the description, if you do want to skip the intro completely and get right to the analysis, go ahead and hit that little timestamp down there. And it'll get you to that. For all everybody else, I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. I have been MIA, I know. I was building a fence, repairing a fence, getting things hooked up. I put a picture. So, you know, if you guys are interested in that, I made a post about it and put a little picture up. It was a nightmare to do. It took me 7 days, a straight week. Like I said, I did go back in time. This is 2012, and I did pick Wesley So versus Levon Aronian. And you guys notice that, you know, we have different flags. We got the Philippines flag for Wesley So and the Armenian flag for Levon Aronian. As you guys do know, they are both currently United States players. Levon Aronian just moved out here. So actually, he hasn't started representing the U.S. yet. As of the Grand Swiss, he was still, according to FIDE, representing Armenia. So he will be, I believe, the next major tournament he's going to be, representing the United States. So anyways, this is taken from round 4, of the U.S. Open, or not the U.S. Open. What is the Open? Hold on, I'm spacing on what it is. Hold on. Yes, the Chess Olympiad. The Chess Olympiad. So it is from the 40th Chess Olympiad. Like I said, 2012. So if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. Bam! E4. E5, we see knight to F3. We got knight to C6, bishop to B5. And then we have knight to F6. So we do have the Berlin defense. The brick wall of openings. You guys know that Vladimir Kramnik, did use it pretty successfully against, Gary Kasparov in their 2000 match. But it's not usually what somebody plays to try to win. They just basically try to make it impossible for white to try to win. We do have castles by white. We got knight takes E4. We see rook down to E1. Knight comes up to D6. We do see knight taking E5. And, of course, as you guys probably know, anybody who's watched my stuff, you do not win a bishop if you capture here, because knight taking C6, and you're going to have to cry a river because your queen is trapped. So don't do that. Do what Levon did. He went bishop to E7, and that is covering the file. So then now you retreat the bishop back to F1. We see knight taking E5, rook taking E5. We see castles by black. We got D4, bishop to F6, a rook down to E1. We see rook to E8, and then we have bishop to F4. Both players are trying to get their stuff out. This, you can always kind of fiend keto. It's not generally what people do, but, trying to move this knight out of the way somewhere, not over there, but trying to get the knight out of the way so you can push the d pawn is usually pretty preferred. We actually see rook takes E1, queen takes E1, and then we have knight back to E8 like I was mentioning before. And some of you guys might be sitting there wondering, why didn't we just take the pawn on D4? I mean, that's a great question. Let's look at it. So, it looks like, you put the rook on E8, you captured on E1, you deflected the queen away, now you got a juicy pawn that you could just grab, right? Well, there's a certain way that you have to kind of play. If you feel like, okay, I'm going to grab a pawn, I'm going to grab another pawn, and I'm going to grab this rook, and I'm going to be up the exchange, you would be sadly mistaken. Because after bishop takes D4, bishop is going to be taking D6, and you absolutely have to take back this bishop, and you cannot go into this series of bishop takes B2, because bishop is going to be taking C7, and you actually have some issues here. You are down an entire piece, and so like I said, you're not going to be just getting the rook for free. You absolutely cannot capture here because you are looking at back rank mate, so you have some issues. The queen is going to be forced to go over to F8, and then knight comes up to F3. And after the bishop takes on A1, you actually take back with the queen, and you guys can see that you're up an entire piece. So, I mean, you got to be really, really careful when you're thinking about grabbing some materials. Most of the time, stuff is not just free. So like I said, the knight comes back to e8. We see queen up to e3, a way to, you know, go ahead and try to protect the pawn. And this is the novelty of the game. So first time we've ever seen that. I mean, generally you see c3. That is going to be, you know, kind of just to strengthen your pawn chain up and stuff. And, you know, develop the knight maybe, you know, by way of bishop, you know, knight to d2. And then bringing it up to f3. But like I said, we do see queen e3. So we got d5. Knight comes to d2. We see bishop to f5. And then we now see c3. And you pretty much did like kind of the same thing I was talking about anyway. I mean, you develop the knight here. The knight is going to be swinging to f3 at some point. And you do have this nice little pawn chain here. So we do have h6. The rook comes over to e1. We see c6. Black is thinking about doing the exact same thing. The queen steps over to g3. Why not try to win a pawn? I mean, why not? If black does something lazy, let's say a6, just for the sake of, you know, showing it, you know, the bishop would be taken on h6 and you have just won a pawn. But black is not going to do that. They actually cover that pin with bishop to g6. The knight comes to f3 like I was saying before. We do see queen down to b6. We got b4. a5, a3, pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4. And then we do have queen back to d8. And then we have knight to e5. And this is by far the most desirable square for this knight to go to. It is beautifully centered. It's a true octopus. Just looking at all of the squares that it is attacking or controlling, that is exactly where you want your knight to be. So this knight cannot live. It has to die. So bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5. You do see king sidestepping over to h7. You see bishop to d3. Knight comes to c7. We see bishop down to c1. We are kind of trying to, you know, prevent the rook from penetrating because the rook for black is actually on a really nice open file. So we are trying to be as restrictive as possible. This is a really juicy point because it is attacking one of your backward pawns. So we don't want to allow that. Bishop takes d3. Queen takes d3 with check. The king sidesteps back up to g8. We see f4, just solidifying this pawn in the center. We got queen down to h4. And, you know, this is a very, like, nice tempo gaining move because we are attacking this undefended rook here on d1 or e1. That's why you always have to be very careful, you know, when you have your pieces just kind of out on the board. You will always want to try to make sure that your pieces are coordinated. You know, it's not like black is winning any material unless you just literally forget about your rook and just, like, do something like this and then your rook is just gone. But, I mean, you know, you always want to make sure when you're developing, you have your pieces coordinated and, you know, you don't get any tempos gained on it. So the rook sidesteps over to f1. We see rook down to a2, the most logical place for this rook to come. We see h3. Knight comes to e6. We do see pawn to c4. We got pawn taking c4, queen taking c4. You know, you absolutely could not allow this capture here because your entire pawn chain just kind of falls apart. So you really have to take on c4. So, like I said, we get in this position here. The rook comes back up to a8. We see king up to h2. You know, we are trying to prevent any type of penetration here on this square. If we allow this queen to get in, this queen definitely has the ability, you know, with this rook to start, you know, causing some havoc behind these pawns. So we do see knight back up to c7. We see queen over to d4. Queen comes up to d8. And you have a couple different options. You can always trade on d8 with queens. But this actually just kind of like, you know, activates black's rook a little bit. You are giving black another file. So this rook, I mean, isn't really super in the game. So it's not like it's winning for black. But like I say, you always want to be careful not to give your opponent too much by trading. So what we actually see in the game is rook, excuse me, rook over to d1. And then the queen drops down on d5. So as you can see, one of the major things that these players do when they're at this level is they are not quick to trade. It's not like trading is bad. I mean, you just have to like kind of pick your moments. You know, what is good for you to be doing. And so you want to kind of trade on some better terms. So the rook comes up to d2, further avoiding the trade because, you know, one thing you have to be thinking about as well is, you know, if you were to trade here, you know, you do activate the knight just a little bit. So, but we actually see queen taking d4, rook taking d4, and then the knight does come down to d5. and you're not coming down with any tempo gains. So we see B5 trying to undermine the protection of this knight. Rook comes down to A2. We see pawn taking C6, pawn taking C6, rook taking rook to C4. Knight comes back to E7. The king comes down to G1. We got H5, and this is a very useful move. You know, H5 is definitely preparing H4 when you can kind of try to freeze these pawns a little bit, you know, just to try to cramp up white's position a little bit. So we actually see G4, pawn takes G4, pawn takes G4, and then we have king over to F8. We got F5. So it kind of seems like, man, I mean, white's starting to get their pawns rolling just a little bit, right? Well, as you'll see, black is actually right in time to be able to prevent anything that white is trying to do. The king steps over to E8. We see bishop to G5. And this is very clear. I mean, bishop is wanting to take this knight and just grab you a free pawn. But like I said, black comes right in time with rook to E2. And it is attacking this, you know, lonely pawn on E5. So we see F6. Rook takes E5. And then we actually have bishop back to F4. Now, you don't have the ability to actually capture anything at the moment. You know, you definitely can't capture here. And in this particular situation, this does not work, but this is something I want you to visualize, because this is definitely something that is very tactical when you get into certain positions. Like, let's say pawn takes here, right? Of course, like I said, it does not work in this position because the rook has the ability to take the bishop right behind the pawn, and you do not have the ability to push this pawn. But visually, I want you to be paying attention, because a lot of the times not a lot of the time, but sometimes you'll be in situations where, you know, the king will be like kind of surrounded by some pawns. And so the problem is when the pawn takes, it actually takes the only square away from the king to be able to come over and try to protect. So you have to be very careful, like when you have the king in these types of situations. Of course, like I said, in this particular situation, the rook is able to take here and get behind the pawn. But let's just say, for example, there was a pawn here instead of a knight, and the rook was like not in this area. This would actually be a very favorable capture because it would be queening next move. So going back, we did have rook taking E5. Bishop does go to F4, and black just decides, hey, I'm gonna give up the exchange. So we see pawn taking F6, bishop taking E5, pawn taking E5, and then we see rook up to C5. We see F6. So you can see white is trying to attack some of black's weaknesses. And we have actually reached a point in the game, finally, that there was a really nice move in the position that we sit in right now. If you want to pause the video and see what Wesley So plays here, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So it's an undermining move. As you guys are probably aware, some of you guys, whenever you are playing against an opponent and you want to try to undermine their pawn chain, you want to try to start at the base. Of course, as you can see, this pawn is very nicely protected by this pawn here. So what better way to try to capture as many pawns as possible but to undermine the pawn that supports the base of the pawn chain? And this move is G5. If you found G5, you're basically putting black in a situation where they can try to capture or they can try to push their pawn, but it's not really beneficial, I mean, for you to allow the capture here. I mean, in this particular situation, you do have king to F7, so that does make a difference. And so that is actually what we see in the game, is king to F7. But you can imagine you being in situations where the king might not be that close. And I mean, you're definitely going to do some damage. Like I said, the king was over here or something like that. That would be a little bit different, because then, like, not that, but you know, then you're going to be capturing. The knight is going to get displaced. You're going to be like scooping up some pawns. So, I mean, every position is different. But like I said, king to F7 did come. The king came up to F2. We see king down to E6. Pawn takes F6. And we have king taking F6. And it is in this position that the players actually agree to a draw. If you look at what the computer says, like all the way down the board, you literally have triple zeros. I mean, there's not... I mean, this knight plus these two pawns, you're basically just going to hold this position as black. You're just pretty much going to shuffle your king kind of like back and forth, up and down, stuff like that. You're going to make sure that this pawn is protected and this knight is never going to like desert this pawn, because then the situation will, you know, change very drastically. So as you guys can see, it is very easy for black to hold the position that they have right here. So Yes, that is that game. So like I said, that is the first time that Wesley So played Levon Aronian. So I appreciate you guys very much. And for all my people in the Philippines, did I not start? You know, it's been a minute since I made a video, man. I didn't even say any Tagalog at first. I just realized that. Let me speak some Tagalog right now. So, what is the phrase that I learned? I think it's kapaya paan sa inyo. Is that right? Kapaya paan? I don't know. I don't have the page. Kapaya paan sa inyo. Magandang umaga. Kamusta na aking makaibigan? Masaya kong makita kang muli. Hello, you lit. Mabuhay to you. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. And I will get these good mornings for everybody real quick. So, maayong buntag. Mayad na agahan. Naibag na bigat. Masanta siya kabasan. Marhe na aga. Buenos dias. Maayong aga. Mapia na uma. Mapia, I think I'm kind of spacing a little bit. Mayad na agahan. Mapia agay, mapia kapapita, my big abukla. Marja na buntag, Maria my nat. Maupe na aga, kasanyangan si LOB. Salam, assalamu alaikum, merci. And I feel like I butchered those. I mean, I think I left one or two out, probably. It's been a really long time since I did those. So forgive me. I'm going to get back in it. I'm going to refresh my memory with it. But I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Makito tayo mamaya to all my people in the Philippines, and I'll see y'all next time.